The courtroom didn't feel like the beginning of a conflict anymore. It felt like the result of years of silent financial structure finally being forced into daylight. Outside that room, the story of this family had looked ordinary. A suburban home with a monthly mortgage, utility bills stacked in a kitchen drawer, grocery receipts from weekly supermarket runs, and automatic car payments that quietly drained checking accounts every month without anyone questioning who was truly sustaining what. But inside the legal system, those everyday details were no longer background noise. They were evidence of financial behavior, ownership patterns, and responsibility distribution. The young white American woman had once been underestimated in that environment. To others, she looked like someone who was simply part of the household, not someone who understood how the household actually functioned financially. But that assumption had always been wrong. She had learned early that control does not come from income alone. It comes from tracking where every dollar goes. She knew which account the mortgage was drafted from. She knew which credit card carried the insurance premiums. She knew when the grocery spending spiked and when car maintenance payments were automatically triggered. Not because she was obsessed with money, but because she understood something most people ignored. Cash flow reveals truth long before arguments do. Her husband, the quiet white American billionaire sitting across from her in court, represented a different kind of financial intelligence. He understood assets, leverage, timing, and structure. His wealth was not loud, it was layered. He did not display status through consumption, but through control of systems most people never saw. Yet, even he had learned something in this situation, that wealth alone does not override documentation. Because in family law, influence without proof is just narrative, and narrative does not move judges. Between them sat the reality of their shared life: bank statements, tax filings, school payments, insurance policies, and legal correspondence. Each document was a timestamp of responsibility. Each transaction was a record of who stepped in when obligations appeared. And slowly, the pattern became visible, not through emotion, but through structure. Outside the courtroom, in a quieter moment before proceedings resumed, the billionaire had once observed something simple about her behavior that most people missed. She never argued about money. She documented it. While others reacted emotionally to financial pressure, she tracked it. While others tried to win conversations, she built records. That difference, subtle but decisive, was what now separated perception from legal reality. Even the lawyers in the room treated the case differently once they saw the organization of her records. The custody file was not just paperwork, it was a timeline. It showed school attendance payments, medical expenses covered without dispute, and consistent financial responsibility that formed a clear structure of care. Nothing about it was dramatic. That was exactly why it was powerful. The judge flipped through a preliminary summary and paused longer than expected, as if noticing something that didn't match the spoken version of events. The husband shifted slightly, but still did not speak. Silence in that room was no longer confusion, it was compression. The truth was narrowing down to what could be verified. And somewhere between the financial records and the custody documentation, one final element remained unseen but central: a single consolidated file that had not yet been opened in full, containing the complete financial and legal history of the child's care. What was inside it would not change emotions in the room. It would change authority. And the moment it was revealed, there would be no need for interpretation, only acknowledgement. In the quiet space between pages of legal documents and spoken testimony, a deeper pattern began to emerge, one that had nothing to do with personalities and everything to do with perception. Because most people in situations like this were not actually reacting to facts. They were reacting to beliefs they had carried for years about money, power, and relationships. And in this case, those beliefs were breaking apart one by one inside a courtroom built on evidence, not assumptions. The first false belief was that silence equals weakness. The young woman sitting calmly with the custody file in front of her was not silent because she had nothing to say. She was silent because she understood that saying less is often how you preserve more, especially when every financial detail already exists in documented form. Meanwhile, loud accusations from the opposing side filled the room, but volume did not translate into authority. In court, noise is not power. Proof is. The second false belief was that not displaying wealth means not having it. Her husband, the quiet white American billionaire, embodied a different reality entirely. He did not rely on visible luxury or public status to establish credibility. His wealth existed in structures, holdings, agreements, and systems designed to operate without attention. Yet in the courtroom, that same restraint meant nothing unless it aligned with legal records. Looking rich is performance. Owning assets is documentation. The third false belief was that living in a home means owning it. In suburban life, this confusion is common. People associate presence with possession. But mortgage statements, property records, and title documents tell a different story. A house is not owned by the person who lives inside it, nor even by the one who contributes emotionally to the household. It is owned by the name on the title and the structure of the financial obligation behind it. Everything else is temporary access. The fourth false belief was that income equals wealth. In reality, income is only movement. Assets are structure. Someone can earn more and still own nothing if that income is constantly consumed by liabilities, mortgage payments, insurance costs, credit obligations, and daily expenses that never convert into long-term ownership. Wealth is not how much flows in, but what remains legally secured after the flow stops. And finally, the most dangerous belief in the room, that emotion can override evidence. It cannot. Feelings can shape narratives, influence tone, and even sway social perception, but they do not change bank records, custody filings, or signed agreements. In this case, emotion was loud, but documentation was final. A question began forming implicitly in the silence of the courtroom. How many people mistake visibility for control? How many assume they understand their financial reality simply because they understand their daily experience of it? And how often do people confuse participation in a system with ownership of it? The contrast in that room became sharper with every passing minute. Looking rich versus owning assets, control versus appearance, monthly payments versus real ownership, loud accusations versus quiet documents. One side tried to construct reality through interpretation. The other relied on records that already existed before the argument began. And beneath all of it, still unopened, was the central custody file, containing structured financial timelines, documented responsibilities, and legal proof that had not yet been fully read aloud. What was inside that file did not need interpretation. It only needed to be revealed. And once it was, the entire structure of belief in that room would have to adjust to something far more rigid than opinion, financial and legal reality. At the core of the courtroom tension, beyond the silence, beyond the papers waiting to be read, there was a simpler system at work, one that most people only understand after conflict exposes it. Money in real life does not behave like emotion or memory. It behaves like structure, and structure always leaves traces. The easiest way to understand it is this. Assets are things that either protect your money or bring more money into your control. Liabilities are things that quietly remove money from your control, month after month, without needing permission. A house, for example, can be either, depending entirely on whose name is on the title and who is responsible for the mortgage. The same physical building can represent security for one person and financial pressure for another. In this case, every document in the courtroom was part of that structure. The deed was not just paper, it was ownership defined in legal language. The mortgage statement was not just a bill, it was a record of obligation and cash flow direction. The bank statements were not just numbers, they were evidence of who consistently supported the household financially. And the custody file was not just about parenting, it was a timeline of responsibility translated into legal form. Cash flow, in simple terms, acts like invisible employees. Every payment you make is like hiring someone to move money out of your control or into your future. Some payments build ownership over time, like structured mortgage contributions tied to equity. Other payments simply maintain access without creating any long-term claim. The difference is not emotional, it is mechanical. Money always follows instruction, and instruction is written in contracts, not conversations. That is why documents matter more than dialogue in environments like this. A prenup agreement defines boundaries before emotion enters. A title deed defines ownership regardless of who lives in the space. A bank statement shows actual behavior, not claimed intention. Even something as simple as recorded payment history becomes a silent witness that cannot be influenced by argument. In the courtroom, these systems were already in motion. The judge did not need stories. he needed alignment between responsibility and record. The custody file sitting on the table represented exactly that alignment. It contained school records showing who handled education costs, medical files showing who absorbed health expenses, and payment histories showing consistent financial responsibility over time. Each page reduced uncertainty. Each entry removed emotional interpretation from the equation. The husband, who had been composed and silent, understood this structure at a professional level. As someone familiar with wealth, he understood how assets behave when properly documented. But even understanding systems does not mean controlling outcomes once documentation is complete and legally organized. Wealth does not override records. It only operates within them. The young woman, by contrast, had built her position through consistency rather than strategy. She did not need to argue ownership of her reality because her reality was already recorded. That distinction mattered more than anything being said in the room. Because, in financial and legal systems, what is written down always outlasts what is spoken. And still, the most important element remained untouched: the central custody file, thick with structured documentation, waiting to be fully opened. Its contents were not speculative. They were procedural. They did not describe opinions about responsibility. They mapped responsibility itself across time, payments, and verified actions. Once that file was fully presented, there would be no need for interpretation or debate, only confirmation. And what it confirmed would shift the entire foundation of the case from perception to structure in a single moment. The shift in the courtroom did not come from a verdict or a raised voice. It came from the slow visibility of what had always been present but not yet fully acknowledged. The custody file on the table was now slightly more open than before, its edges no longer contained by silence. Inside it, multiple layers of financial and legal structure were becoming visible at once, like a system revealing itself page by page rather than all at once. At the top layer, a property deed rested inside a protective folder, clean, official, and unmistakably binding. It was not decorative. It was definitive. Beneath it, a bank statement with a single transaction line subtly circled in red showed recurring mortgage payments tied to a specific account. That small circle did more than highlight a number. It identified behavior, consistency, and responsibility over time. Next to it, a printed still frame from a phone video sat clipped into the file. It was not dramatic, not emotional, just timestamped documentation capturing a moment relevant to custody responsibility. The kind of evidence that does not argue, it simply exists. Beside that, a prenup agreement in a sealed envelope remained untouched, its presence alone signaling that financial boundaries had been defined long before the courtroom ever became necessary. On the attorney's table, the full custody file now rested in view. Its weight was not physical, it was structural. School records were embedded within it, along with medical documentation and payment histories that tracked who consistently handled essential responsibilities. Each document reinforced the same pattern: actions recorded over time, not claims made in the moment. Even outside the folder, smaller symbols of financial structure were visible. A company badge placed in a wallet suggested professional identity tied to economic systems beyond the household. A set of newly issued keys sat quietly on the edge of the table, representing controlled access rather than emotional possession. None of these items were dramatic on their own. Together, they formed a complete financial and legal map of authority. The young white American woman remained composed as she observed the gradual shift in attention toward the file. She did not interrupt. She did not explain. Her stillness was not uncertainty. It was confirmation that everything necessary had already been documented. In her posture, there was no urgency to convince anyone, because the structure did not depend on persuasion. It depended on verification. Across from her, the quiet white American billionaire sat with a measured expression that revealed recognition rather than surprise. He understood immediately what many in the room were only beginning to process. Preparation had already taken place long before this hearing. Not emotional preparation, but structural preparation. He recognized the discipline behind the documentation, the kind that does not appear in arguments, only in outcomes. Yet despite the growing weight of visible evidence, the opposing side still operated under a different assumption. They believed control could still be asserted through narrative, timing, or emotional framing. They continued to treat perception as influence, unaware that influence without documentation loses authority in legal environments. This was the fundamental divide in the room. Those who believed power was expressed through voice, and those who understood it was preserved through systems. Because in financial reality, systems always outlast arguments. The lesson unfolding was not about confrontation. It was about structure. People who understand money do not rely on intensity. They rely on architecture, deeds, statements, filings, records, and verified history. And as the custody file remained open, revealing more of its layered documentation, the atmosphere shifted towards something unavoidable. The next stage was no longer about interpretation. It was about pressure from family expectations, legal scrutiny, and social assumptions that were about to collide with recorded financial truth. By the time the custody file was fully visible on the table, the atmosphere in the courtroom had already begun to shift again, not through resolution, but through pressure. Because once documentation becomes undeniable, people rarely stop arguing. Instead, they change direction. They stop disputing facts and start disputing character. The first wave of pressure came from family, subtle at first, then increasingly direct. The mother-in-law questioned intent rather than evidence, suggesting that this is all being overplayed. The husband's relatives shifted language carefully, trying to reframe structured financial documentation as emotional exaggeration. Even without directly challenging the records, they attempted to weaken their meaning by questioning the person presenting them. Then came the social framing. Words like unfair, dramatic, and too calculated began appearing in conversations that had nothing to do with legal definitions. The implication was clear. If she was organized, she must be manipulative. If she was prepared, she must be suspicious. If she understood the system, she must be using it incorrectly. The husband's position, once quiet and controlled, became more complicated under this pressure. Not because he lacked understanding, but because perception outside the courtroom was beginning to conflict with documentation inside it. He remained composed, but the silence now carried a different weight, not confusion, but constraint. Every attempt to reframe the situation emotionally ran into the same barrier, records that did not change under interpretation. At one point, even the opposing legal voice attempted a shift in strategy. Instead of challenging the custody file directly, the focus moved toward questioning motivation. The suggestion was not that the documents were incorrect, but that the way they were used was unbalanced. It was a familiar tactic in high-conflict financial and custody cases. When evidence cannot be removed, its presenter is reframed instead. But the custody file did not respond to narrative pressure. Inside it remained unchanged. School records showing consistent responsibility, medical documents tied to verified payments, financial transfers linked to direct obligations, and structured timelines that align behavior with accountability. No amount of emotional reframing could disconnect those links. The young white American woman did not react to the shifting tone in the room. She had already moved past the stage where interpretation mattered. Her focus remained on structure, not perception. In her stillness, there was no attempt to defend herself against labels like calculated or unfair, because those labels did not exist in the language of documentation. Across the table, the quiet white American billionaire observed this transition with a level of understanding that was not emotional, but analytical. He recognized a familiar pattern in financial disputes involving families. When ownership is unclear in perception, people attempt to resolve it through social pressure rather than legal clarity. But systems built on documentation do not bend under social interpretation. This was where most people misunderstand money-related conflict. They assume the strongest position is the one that looks the most justified socially. In reality, the strongest position is the one that can be verified structurally. And structural truth does not require agreement. It only requires confirmation. Still, the pressure in the room continued to rise, not because the evidence was weak, but because the implications were becoming unavoidable. If the custody file was accepted as complete, then roles, responsibilities, and financial accountability would have to be assigned accordingly. That is where discomfort begins, not in proving truth, but in accepting what truth restructures. And that was the turning point forming quietly beneath everything else. Because the next stage was no longer about whether the documents were real. It was about what happens when real. Documentation forces a system of relationships, money, and responsibility to reorganize itself, legally, permanently, and without emotional negotiation. The moment the custody file was finally opened in full, the courtroom stopped feeling like a place for arguments and started functioning like a place for verification. No one spoke immediately, not because they were unsure what to say, but because the structure inside the file was already speaking louder than anyone in the room. The judge leaned forward slightly as page after page was revealed, each one adding a layer of financial and legal clarity that could not be undone by interpretation. At the top of the file was the property deed. It did not contain opinions, explanations, or emotional context. It contained a name, clearly printed, legally registered, and tied to ownership of the home in question. That single page answered a question that had been subtly present since the beginning of the hearing. Who actually held title to the property being discussed in emotional terms outside the courtroom? Below it were mortgage payment records. Not summaries, not estimates. Transaction histories pulled directly from bank systems. The entries showed consistent payments linked to a specific account, with timestamps spanning years. Each line confirmed a pattern of financial responsibility that aligned with legal ownership structure rather than assumption. Next came bank statements with highlighted transfers. Some were marked for mortgage allocation, others for insurance coverage tied to the property, and others for household-related obligations. None of these entries required interpretation. They required acknowledgement. The financial flow was documented, traceable, and consistent over time. Then the prenup agreement appeared, folded carefully inside its envelope, previously signed and notarized. It defined financial boundaries long before conflict ever entered the relationship. Its presence reframed the entire case, not as a sudden dispute, but as a system that had already been structured in advance and legally recognized by both parties. The custody file itself contained the most decisive layer. School records showed consistent enrollment responsibility tied to one parent. Medical files showed payment continuity without interruption. Activity fees, insurance documentation, and emergency expenses were all recorded and attributed. There were no gaps in responsibility, only continuity. A final section included a short recorded file from a phone video, time-stamped and legally submitted, showing a routine moment tied to caregiving responsibility. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. Its purpose was verification, not persuasion. As each layer was read or displayed, something subtle but undeniable happened in the room. The emotional narrative that had been building earlier lost its structure. Not because it was disproven by argument, but because it was outmatched by documentation. The shift was quiet, but complete. Even the opposing side stopped attempting verbal reframing. There was nothing left to reinterpret without contradicting the written record. The mistress, who had previously relied on social framing of the situation, no longer had a narrative strong enough to compete with legal consistency. The husband remained still, his expression tightening slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. He understood exactly what had happened. The system had spoken, not through confrontation, but through structure. The young woman did not react outwardly. She simply allowed the file to remain open, as if nothing about this moment required performance. And in that stillness, the difference between perception and ownership became impossible to ignore. The quiet white American billionaire finally broke the silence with a single sentence, calm, precise, and almost instructional in tone. Money doesn't decide outcomes in court. Documentation does. Cash flow explains life, but records define authority. That line did not escalate the situation. It clarified it. And with that clarity came the next unavoidable phase. Consequences that were no longer emotional or social, but legal and financial. Consequences that would be enforced not by argument, but by the structure of law itself. After the final pages of the custody file were reviewed, the courtroom did not erupt into celebration or conflict. Instead, it shifted into something more procedural, more final: implementation. Because in legal and financial systems, once documentation reaches confirmation, the next step is not debate. It is enforcement. The attorneys on both sides began to move differently. The tone changed from argument to acknowledgement. The property deed was cross-verified with county records. The mortgage payment history was confirmed through bank-issued statements. Insurance documents tied to the home were matched with policy databases. Every major financial claim inside the custody file was now being validated against external institutional records. The judge requested confirmation from the clerk. A quiet exchange followed as official copies were stamped and reviewed. Nothing about the process was dramatic, but everything about it was irreversible. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do: align legal ownership with documented reality. At one point, a bank representative's verification report was referenced, confirming the consistency of payment history and account attribution tied to household expenses. There were no discrepancies large enough to alter the structure of the case. The financial record stood intact under institutional review. As the legal process moved forward, practical adjustments began to take place. Access permissions were updated in accordance with ownership documentation. Keys and property access protocols were reclassified under the verified title holder. These changes were not symbolic. They were administrative, executed through standard legal channels. The husband, still composed, now appeared less like a participant in a dispute and more like someone observing the final alignment of a system he understood well but no longer controlled. The mistress, who had once tried to frame the situation socially, no longer had any usable narrative leverage. Social interpretation had no function in a space governed entirely by documentation and enforcement. The young white American woman remained steady throughout the process. There was no visible shift in expression because nothing in the outcome required emotional validation. Everything had already been established in the custody file long before the courtroom reached this stage. What was happening now was not discovery, it was confirmation being executed in real time. The quiet white American billionaire observed the procedural closure with a neutral expression. If anything, his presence underscored a broader truth in the room. Financial systems do not resolve through confrontation. They resolve through structure being applied consistently over time. As the hearing moved toward finalization, the judge acknowledged the completeness of the record. The custody arrangement, financial responsibilities, and property rights were now being formally aligned with verified documentation. Nothing remained ambiguous in the legal framework. Outside the emotional noise that had existed earlier in the case, a simple reality now stood clearly in place. Assets are not protected by arguments, but by titles. Obligations are not defined by intent, but by records. And control does not belong to whoever speaks the loudest, but to whoever is correctly documented within the system. Before closing remarks could fully conclude, the legal team began outlining standard post-hearing procedures, transfer confirmations, account adjustments where required, and enforcement of custody and property terms exactly as recorded. Everything proceeded in a controlled, administrative flow that left no room for reinterpretation. And yet, even as the legal structure settled into place, there remained one final layer unspoken: the shift in identity that follows when someone realizes that financial reality is not something you argue with, but something you build and protect long before conflict ever arrives. That final understanding was still forming, and it would define everything that came next. In the final silence that followed the court's procedural closing, there was no dramatic ending, no emotional resolution, and no symbolic victory scene. What remained instead was something far more permanent: alignment between reality and record. The case was no longer being discussed. It was being executed through systems that do not require attention to function. And in that quiet aftermath, the identity shift became clearer than anything said inside the courtroom. Because what had actually been decided was not just custody, property access, or financial responsibility. It was something deeper. Who in this story understood how power actually works when money is involved? The young white American woman, once underestimated by everyone who assumed she was reacting emotionally rather than building structurally, had demonstrated something most people miss until it is too late. Financial security is not built in arguments, it is built in documentation. She did not win through intensity. She won through consistency. Every record, every payment, every file, every time-stamped responsibility had formed a system that protected her position before anyone else even recognized a conflict existed. The quiet white American billionaire, who had observed the entire process with measured calm, represented another layer of the same truth. He understood the machinery behind wealth. The difference between appearance and ownership, between liquidity and structure, between influence and legal reality. But even his presence in the room reinforced something important. Understanding money is not the same as controlling outcomes when systems have already been properly documented. In a structured financial environment, even powerful individuals must operate within recorded reality. Across the case, the contrast was no longer between people. It was between approaches to life itself. One approach relied on perception, who looks right, who speaks confidently, who controls the narrative in the moment. The other relied on structure, who is named in the title, who is recorded in the bank statements, who is listed in the custody file, who has maintained consistent responsibility over time. And when those two approaches collide in a legal system, only one of them survives intact, the one backed by evidence. The broader lesson that emerged was not emotional, and it was not personal. It was mechanical. People who understand money at a deeper level do not try to win conflicts through volume or validation. They build systems where conflict cannot easily erase their position. They rely on ownership, not assumption, on cash flow records, not verbal claims, on legal documentation, not social interpretation. And most importantly, they remain calm because they do not depend on uncertainty to define their security. Meanwhile, those who rely on emotion as financial strategy often discover too late that feeling certain is not the same as being correctly documented. In environments like courts, banks, and legal proceedings, emotion has no authority. Only structure does. The courtroom had already made that distinction clear without needing to announce it. Every decision that followed was simply the continuation of a system that had already been established long before anyone entered the room. The young woman learned, through experience rather than theory, what it means to protect something before it is threatened. Not through confrontation, but through preparation. Not through control of others, but through control of records. And that understanding now defined her identity moving forward, not as someone reacting to financial conflict, but as someone operating within financial structure. The quiet billionaire's role in this story also reinforced a final truth. Wealth is not loud when it is stable. It does not need to perform, explain, or justify itself. It simply exists in organized form, protected by law, supported by documentation, and maintained through discipline rather than emotion. And that is where the story ultimately resolves, not in who spoke the most, but in who was correctly recorded when it mattered. Because in the end, power in financial reality is never proven through noise. It is proven through what remains when the noise is removed. Ownership, structure, documentation, and truth that does not depend on being believed. And the final lesson is simple, but absolute. Don't try to look powerful. Build a life where truth, assets, and evidence protect you silently. The judge asked where the child was.